I just bought the new RSV Mark IIs, and I also have the NICEHCK Rockies here as well. And today we're going to be comparing these two to see if they live up to the hype or not, because these are very different from one another, pretty much polar opposites. But yeah, let's just get into it. Starting with the RSV Mark IIs, these are a base C all-rounder set with great base impact. They are basically the direct upgrade to the Hype Force, but with even more base impact now. And they're doing this with full BAs, so I don't know how, but yeah, Softwares have done a great job. Now versus the original RS5, which is more mid-range focused, more vocal forward, you know, it pops out more in the singers. The Mark IIs are now like noticeably more bassy and heavy when it comes to the sub bass, the slam, the mid bass, the drums, and overall just more all-rounded, unlike the OG, which is like more forward, powerful in the vocal presentation. The Mark II's mid-range is now a little bit more like tame, slightly more recessed, but not too in your face or like too pushback either. It's like a balanced kind of vocal presentation. As a vocal lover myself, I personally would like more upper mids in 3 to 6K, but the Mark II's cuts that out because some people found that to be a little bit too forward, maybe, you know, a little bit too shouty in your face. But the 1 to 2K bump still allows the vocals to be forward and open enough to bring out enough clarity without sounding like overly nasally or dark. Vocal-wise, this is still pretty natural overall. Now, as for the OG RS5, I actually got a recent unit, so the 2025 version, and that one looks a lot different than the first one I got like 3 years ago. So as for the most recent 2025 RS5 Mark 1s, those are still going to be more mid-range centric because there's just less treble, there's less bass. It does need more scaling now because it is a bit dark at lower volumes, but once you give it more scaling, it is still vocal centric, but it doesn't have like the same resolution and power as the original, I mean not original, but like pre-retuned RS5 like 3-4 years ago. So it's kind of an iffy thing because I don't know if it's just like my unit per se, but I would look out for future RS5s. I can no longer like just straight up blind recommend them as like the de facto vocal set. But as for the RS5 Mark IIs, these are still a good bassy all-rounder. But speaking of bass, let's talk about the low end on the RS5 Mark IIs because that's the main selling point and the main differentiator from the other all-rounders or even the Mark 1s, because the low end is very satisfying when it comes to slam, the no weight to the drums, the bass guitars. They do it very well. Unlike the warmer, thicker, and heavier tonality of the Meta inspired hump at around 500, this instead is more dynamic, it's thunderous, it slams hard and then lingers just enough before pulling back and snapping back. Now there is a little bit of coloration where male vocals can sound a bit heavier, huskier, because you do get a good amount of bass boost, but it is tastefully done and it's not like obnoxious or ruins the vocals and the treble. It pulls back just like at the right amount and it gives you a heavier no weight and tonality to the sound, but it's still pretty well balanced overall. Quantity wise, I wouldn't say the low end on this is like bass head level like amount, but it's definitely more than enough for most people, and it leans more towards like the bassier set of the all-rounders like the EW300, the cleans, the high fours. So if you like those like bassier all-rounder sound signatures or even the CCA hydros, you're most likely gonna enjoy the RS5 Mark IIs. Treble wise, the Mark IIs are also pretty smooth. There's no like huge sudden peaks that jumps out and it goes back. You get enough air, the extension is there. I wouldn't say it's super sparkly or have that EST sauce because, you know, it doesn't have any ESTs, which we'll talk more about that later, but it does its job, it doesn't ruin the mid-range, and you're not gonna complain it about being too energetic or artificial sounding. So basically, if you're looking for a bassy, thumpy, like dynamic low end, but you still want everything else done at a pretty high level with natural timbre, then that would be the RS5 Mark IIs. And in my opinion, if you like the Hype Force, this would be a slight upgrade to the Hype Force because technical performance wise, these are okay for the price, which I believe should be around 700 USD. It's not cheap by any means, and they sit around the VOLARE and the MK5 EST level, which is good technical performance. But when it comes to value, those two are both cheaper with ESTs, and the top row is also better in the details. So is the Rockies, which we'll talk about later, for, you know, cheaper than the Mark IIs. Basically, you are paying a premium for these for the better low end. The texture is just noticeably better than the other ones, but aside from that, it is debatable if it is worth it to you. Genre wise, the Mark II works great for hip hop, rap, pop, EDM, R&B because the low end is very dynamic and engaging, and it brings those genres to life and makes the rhythmic section very enjoyable, while the upper mids are tame for the more energetic production on EDM and pop stuff. The bass might be a little bit too forward for some instrumental and orchestral stuff. It might get in the way a little bit, but overall it's still a very good all-rounder and you're pretty safe to hit shuffle on your library for most of the songs. Scaling wise, these are a mid to mid high volume set at around 70 to 80 dBs depending on how much bass and treble there is in the track, because the low end is already very forward, it's already pretty prominent, and any more can get a little bit like bass fatigue for non-bass heads. But the overall upper mids and the treble is pretty smooth and not overly boosted, it's not peaky, which is why it can still pretty decent, but don't expect it to be like a full explore levels of scaling. These are pretty good but not like super high scaling. And when it comes to tips, I recommend the stock clear ones that it comes with. I think it strikes a really good balance already in terms of just like smoothness, detail, and the low end, but you can go for the Velvet, the Venus, or the Final Yeast if you want a little bit more low end. I personally think it does have enough, but if you want more, you could go for it, or you can even go for something like the Clarions, the Atlas Sendas for more treble to kind of open up the sound. The only downside to switching to those is that they won't scale as well because it's just a little bit more V-shaped now and not as smooth as the clears. Then as for the unboxing experience and the accessories, these are an upgrade over the original RS5s. If you look at the plating, it is now a lot more like modern, sleek, minimalistic, less bling bling than the OGs. I do like this better, but the main issue is that value wise, it doesn't have ESTs when it's competition at around 500 to 600. A lot of them have ESTs like the Rockies, which we will talk about later. And then you got the Origins as well. That's also a basic kind of set. And of course you got the Volare, the MK1, the Oracle Mark IIIs, they all have ESTs. So when it comes to pure value, I don't think this is the best at its price, but the sound kind of makes up for it in my opinion if you can overlook that and if you really want a bassy all-rounder kind of sound. For example, compared to the THIEAUDIO Origin, it is around the same price, but it has Sony ESTs, it has a more quote-unquote unique driver setup with the bone conduction driver, and it's also a bassy kind of all-rounder set. And tech-wise, I would give it to the Origin. It just feels more detailed in the treble. I don't know if it's the ESC or the tuning, but it is technically better than the RSV Mark IIs, whereas this is like more heavy in the bass, it's more like impactful, authoritative, and the Origin's kind of like more bouncy, more tight, and not as smooth as the Mark IIs. But overall, if you're just talking about like technical performance and I guess like driver setup or driver count, whatever, then the Origin is like a quote-unquote better value. But that aside, both the Origin and the RSV Mark IIs are one of the best like bassy all-rounders under $1,000. Then versus some of the other $500 to $600 sets, they all pull out more detail like the Rockies, the Top Pro, the Shunmuke, the Oracle Mark IIIs. So even though I do like really like the RSV Mark II, it does have the base sauce. However, I would still recommend waiting for these to go on sale for around $550 because the tech and the driver setup isn't super competitive at $700, even though the sound is pretty good in my opinion. And this would be a great upgrade to like the EW300, the clean, the high 4s, or even a side grade to the sparklier and cleaner Top Pros. But if you want more detail and just more technical performance, you can find cheaper and quote-unquote better value stuff. So similar to the OG RS5 that came out a long time ago, the Mark IIs do succeed in the way that it does have that special sauce, but just in a different way. On the other hand, as for the Rockies, these are the polar opposite to the RS5 Mark IIs. The main selling point on the Rockies is the treble extension and the detail you get for the price. The overall sound of the Rockies is pretty balanced. It has a grounded low end but with an emphasis in the treble detail, and you do get that extension in the ESTs. Basically, the Rockies remind me of an airier and fuller Top Pro with ESTs. It's less sparkly and less clear, less forward in the vocals, and the timbre and the treble extension is just a little bit airier than the Top Pros. Now, this doesn't mean the Top Pro is now irrelevant, relaxed. It's still a very good value set, still amazing set for the price. If you like a sparklier sound with more emphasis, more pop in the singers, then the Top Pro still does that better than the Rockies because the vocals on the Rockies are just pulled back more, the extension is cut, and then the vocal gain is also like tame. So in terms of vocal presentation, the Top Pro still does that better, and it does have more of a sparkle versus like the airiness on the Rockies. However, if you like a tamer vocal presentation, then the Rockies does that better because it just handles more energetic tracks a lot better, like J-pop and K-pop, which tends to overboost the higher frequencies. The upper mids cut on the Rockies helps a lot with that. So when it comes to that, if you want a tamer and smoother sound, then the Rockies are slightly better than the Top Pros. And being the Rockies back and forth with the Top Pros and the Mark IIs, the Rockies do feel a little more open in the staging because both the low end and the vocals are just like pushed back more, which gives it a bigger perception of space. And then on top of this, the decay from the cymbal crashes are also extended longer. It feels a bit airier and the notes just linger on a little bit longer because of the ESCs probably, or just how they implemented the ESCs, which gives that extra airiness that also helps with like the more openness in the staging. Now as for the low end, the Rockies are just okay in my opinion. It doesn't do anything crazy. You get a little bit of the rumble. It's not gonna be like too forward. It's more in the background. The mid bass has enough energy for the drums. The guitar separation is good. It's not gonna slam nearly as well as the RS5 Mark IIs, which some of you guys are gonna like more than the Rockies, even though the Rockies are more detailed and have ESC. So it's kind of weird how this works, but the low end on the Mark IIs are just noticeably better, more enjoyable to me personally. Aside from that, it just does its job. It doesn't like get in the way of the treble, which is the main star of the show, because both the upper mids and the low end is pushed back more in the background to highlight the treble a little bit more. It's not like over boosted. It has that special sauce in the treble, but it's not artificially boosted like the Dunu Brain Damage, and it's not thin like the Dunu Brain Damage either. This basically makes the Brain Damage irrelevant when it comes to treble quality, and because it has ESTs as well, and it's just better tuned. Then in terms of technical performance, the Rockies also sit around the same level as the Top Pros, which is very good. It's only slightly behind some of the more expensive stuff like the Monarch Mark IV, the Prestige, the 1K plus IEMs, but they also slightly above the other $500, $600 sets. Basically, for the price, the Rockies punch above its price range detail wise, and overall it's just a very good value, like same tier as the Top Pros in my opinion, if not a little bit better because it does have ESTs now. The unboxing, the accessories are also very good. Like you get a very nice case, a very nice cable, and overall it's just a very good package for around $500 to $600, and it's kind of hard to beat. The plating looks pretty nice as well, so yeah, I do recommend these. If I had to pick, the only real nitpick would be the low end. If you're looking for more bass, that's just not it. The slam, the impact, the rumble is like, I would say it's barely enough. I think it's enough if your library fits it well, which I'll talk about later. But if you're looking for a more bassy kind of sound, this would not be your thing. As well as if you're looking for a more vocal-centric IEM, the Top Pros would be better for that. And even some of the other stuff like the OG Oracles will be better for that as well, since the upper mids, the vocals again, are more pushed back on this. Now in terms of genres, I would recommend rock, bands, metal, indie, instrumentals, or classical with the Rockies, because the extra air and space gives the track an ethereal feeling to the sound, especially in the cymbals, as the decay is very nice. And also the layering is just very good for more instrumental heavy tracks, while the tamer, vocals, upper mids helps with the energetic electric guitars. Then tip-wise, most tips would work aside from maybe the clarions or the ones that boost the treble more, or like just gimps the treble, because it already has enough treble in my opinion, so you don't need any more. And if you get the tips that gimps the treble, then it kind of like defeats the purpose of the special EST sauce. So yeah, aside from those two, just play around with it, because this is pretty versatile when it comes to just like tips. I am using the stock clear blue ones that it came with, but you can just like use anyone, and I think it would sound pretty great with the Rockies. Then scaling wise, the Rockies are a mid volume set mainly because of the extra EST or the air from the treble. Lero Hell model, for example, I can't crank it up too much, or else like these cymbals just get a bit too energetic, so you can't really crank them too much or it's gonna get overwhelming. But these can go up to around like 75, 77 dBs or so. I think it is more than enough for most people. Now versus some other all-rounders at around its price, if you want the best treble playback, it would either be the Volare or the Rockies, depending on your preference. Both are very smooth and well extended, with the main difference being that the Volare is just a better quote-unquote all-rounded set, because the vocals, the upper mids are more filled in. Overall, it's just more all-rounded, whereas the Rockies are slightly more treble emphasized. Then when it comes to technical performance at around its price, the best I've heard would be the Rockies, the Gate, and the Top Pros. It just depends on what sound you're looking for, because all three of them are leaner when it comes to the low end. For example, if you're looking for like more pop mini vocals, more sparkle, then that would be the Top Pros. It's just more vocal centric out of the bunch. If you want the most neutral and balanced presentation, you don't want the sound to lean in any regions, then that would be the Gate. It's just very neutral, the most neutral out of the bunch. And then finally, if you want the most like airy treble, a little bit like more pushback when it comes to vocals, then that would be the Rockies. So all three are still pretty competitive, just depends on what you're looking for. Then lastly, in terms of low end texture, my pick would still be the RSV Mark IIs or the THIEAUDIO Origin, because those two just do the bass a step above the other ones by a little bit more. However, those two are around $200 more. So second place, I would give it over to the Oracle Mark IIIs at around the same price of $500 to $600. The low end is still very good, the texture is good, it's slightly better than the other ones, but it's not as unique as the RSV Mark IIs. It just slams heavier, more impact, more authority, and then the Origin is just like tighter, bouncier with the bone conduction, and the Mark IIIs are just kind of like an all-rounder bassy set that is still pretty good, but not as unique as the other two, but also not as expensive. But that aside, in conclusion, I can safely recommend the Rockies given its competitive pricing, the great accessories, unboxing experience, and most importantly, the performance, the detail, and the value that you get from the Rockies. And as for the RSV Mark IIs, these get a half recommendation because it's just a little bit too pricey, even though the sound is very good. Like if you're looking for bass, this is one of the best like bassy all-rounders you can get under $1,000. But personally, I would just wait for these to go on sale because the value-wise, you're not getting ESTs. Detail-wise, it's not as competitive as some of the other stuff. So still very good, but maybe wait for it to go on sale. Anyhow, I hope this review was helpful. I'm currently on vacation in China, hence the vacation shades. So the setup isn't the best, but stay tuned for the Odyssey 2 review coming up next, and thanks for watching. I will see everyone in the next one.
Shout out to Dom Q, Roark's Cat, BURAC, Discus Goddess, Walker Standard, Patrick, User, Contain Quava Juice Gains, Oh Really, Mr. Gorillas, Polly J, Giseng Young, Christopher Jackson, Henry Claudia, Son of a Horse, 777ZK, Wizard, OB, Triple Well Extended, Frickalicious, Ricardo's, Tapis Art, Chuckle Norris 420, Shrimp Back to Lay, FKSRG, Cousin Fat Fat, Julius Phillip, Dad Riddle, Belha, Armor, Nico, Parham, Nicholas, Addy, Michael, LL Here, Andy, Trackstar, Sherchip, Someone Help Me, Ryan, Shuri, Raphael, I am JRack, Ori, June, Hakase, Over Analog, Cell, Emil, Saki, Sinocloud, Sami, Effie Nadim, EGC, Raj, Samantha, and Chimika. Thank you guys so much for the support.